Okay, what we need to do now that we've got our attendees, when we create an activity, we need to make sure we add the attendee to that activity when we create it. I know our server is going to take care of this on the back end automatically for us, but because we're not returning the activity from the server, then we're going to take care of the actions on the client side so that we replicate on the client what we are doing on the server when we create an activity. And same goes for the editing of an activity. Each of our activities now have additional properties coming back from our server. And our form, for instance, doesn't contain an attendees array. It doesn't have a host username. It doesn't have a host. But our activity objects that we're storing inside our registry are going to have those properties. So we need to look at how we can take care of this and be more specific about the fields that we're using inside just our form, which are, of course, different from the activity object that we now get back from our API. So what we'll do is we'll head back to VS Code, and let's just clean up the tabs at the top. And what we'll do is we'll open up the activity TypeScript file first of all. Now, at the moment, we've got all of these properties as optional to accommodate our form, just so that we didn't get any errors. But now we can remove all of these optional properties, apart from the host actually. We'll leave that as optional, but the attendees is going to be mandatory for our activity. And this means that we'll be able to remove a lot of the optional safety operators, optional chaining and exclamation marks that we've littered inside our code based on the fact that these properties were optional. And what we'll do is we're going to create a class for our activity form values. And by creating a class, this will give us an opportunity to use a constructor to initialize certain values when we do pass an activity object from our API into the constructor of this class. So we'll say export class and we'll say activity form values. And what we'll do is we'll just give it properties. The ID property is always going to be optional, so we'll make this string equals undefined initially. The title we'll set to a string and give it an initial value of just an empty string. We'll do the same for category. String equals just an empty string, and let's make sure the spelling is accurate, because that can give us problems if we get this spelling incorrect in this file. We'll say description is a type of string equals empty string. The date is going to be a type of date, or it's going to be null. And we'll set this equal to null initially. The city will be a string, and the venue is also a string. Now what we'll also do here is we'll add a constructor, and the constructor will take as a parameter an activity, but it's going to be optional because we want to use this activity form values for either creating an activity or editing an existing activity. So we'll say that the activity is of type activity form values. Now what we're going to do is just assign the properties that we need inside our form, nothing else. So our activity that we pass here, it's going to have all sorts of extras in. It's going to have the attendees, it's going to have the host username, and all of that's going to cause us a problem if we try and send up that information to our API and try and edit an activity. So what we'll do is we'll check to make sure we have an activity because we've made this optional. And we'll say list.id is equal to the activity.id, and we're just going to map the properties. So list.title equals activity.title, list.category, activity.category, list.description equals activity.description, and we'll say list.date equals activity.date, and we'll say list.venue equals activity.venue, and we'll say list.city equals activity.city. Not terribly exciting, but this does save us a bit of work down the line. And then we can go ahead and update our activity form. So we'll head to here next, and inside our form, let's see what we're doing just now. And we're using our useState to set the initial properties of our activity. So we can remove all of this code now. and what we can replace it with is a new object and say activity form values. And of course, we need to change the type of our state to activity form values as well. And then what we can do inside our use effect here, if we have an activity, what we're going to do is set this to new activity form values, and we're going to pass in the activity. And this is going to ensure that the activity just contains the values inside the form itself. And if we scroll down, we've probably got another error here for our values. So our handle form submit, the method here that we're using, this is taking an activity of type activity, and we want to change this to activity form values as well. Now, we're either going to have an activity ID or we're not, so we don't need to check the length anymore. And what we'll do is we'll just add a not operator to the start of this. So if we do not have an activity ID, then we're creating a new activity. Otherwise, then we're updating an activity. And of course, our create activity methods are expecting an activity object rather than the activity form values. So we also need to make some adjustments inside our activity store. So we'll head over there next, and let's take a look at our create activity method first of all. So there's a few things that we can remove from here actually that we do not need. We do not need our loading indicators for this one, because what we can use instead is the is submitting flag from Formic that we get. So I'm just going to remove those to start with. And we don't need an edit mode, that somehow managed to stay inside this method, so let's remove that as well. And what we're going to do when we're creating an activity, we need to add our user as an attendee of this activity, and also it's going to be the host of this activity. So what we'll do is we'll say const user equals store.userstore.user. And then we'll say const attendee equals new profile, and we'll pass in our user object. And of course, technically this could be null, so we'll just add the exclamation mark there as well. And we're going to create our activity, but this is going to be of type activity form values now. And of course, in our agent, this is expecting a type of activity. So we also need to go across to our agent as well and change the types for both the create and the update method. Instead of activity, it's going to be activity form values. And same for the second one as well. And back to our activity store. So what we'll do, we'll say const new activity equals, and what we could do with actually is a class for our activity as well, so that we can scaffold a new activity object from the information that we have from our activity form values. So what we'll do, we'll go back to our activity class once again. And we've got an interface for our activity, but what we'll do just below this, we'll say export class activity, and we're going to say implements the activity interface. And what we'll do inside here is we'll give it a constructor, and we'll just say init, make it optional, and say that this is going to be a type of activity form values. And what we want to do with this one is we want to take all of the properties inside here and effectively set the equivalent activity properties. And the shortcut way we can do this is we can say objects.assign, and we can say that the target is this, and we can say the source object is init, whatever we pass into the initial object. So this is going to populate all of the properties that it can into our activity. So we'll go back to the activity store, and we'll say const new activity equals new activity, and we'll pass the activity as its parameter. So what we'll also do is set the other properties that we need. So we need the new activity.host username to equal user.username. And of course, we're not allowed to say that string or undefined is not assignable to type string. So once again, we'll just use the bang operator to remove that error. And we'll say new activity.attendees equals, and we'll create a new array, and we'll pass in the attendee object we created above. And what we'll do, we want to get all of the other properties in our set activity method inside here. We want to set all of these properties as well for our newly created activity. So underneath this, we'll say list.set activity and pass in our new activity so it can work out if the user's going, if they're the host, that sort of thing. And then in our running action method, all we need to do inside here is set their selected activity. And we'll say list.selected activity equals new activity. So this takes care of the create activity. And what we'll do is we'll just update the update activity as well. We can once again remove the loading flags from this. We do not need them. And we'll also remove the edit mode and loading from the running action here as well. And we're going to change the activity to activity form values. And of course we get some additional errors, as we will do as we update these methods. And inside our running action method, what we want to do is just make sure we've got an activity.id, which we will have, of course, but this will just stop us from needing to use the safety operators like the exclamation mark or the optional chaining for this. And we're going to need to get our activity we're passing in here, keep the form values that have been updated, but also get the original other information for that activity as well and combine them together. And one way we can do that is by using a spread operator. So what we'll do is we'll say let's updated activity equals, and then we'll use curly brackets, we'll use the spread operator, and we'll say list.get activity and pass in the activity.id, and then we'll add a comma, and then we'll just spread the other properties that are available in the activity that we're passing in there. And then we'll say list activity registry.set the activity ID, and then we'll say updated activity. And we're getting a warning here, and what's it telling us? It's telling us that argument of type blah 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 is not assignable to type of activity. But what we can do to get around this is say as activity to make the error go away, because we know this updated activity contains all of these properties and the additional properties from our form as well. And anything inside this spread operator will overwrite the same properties from our original activity. And then what we can do is cut this line, and we can say this.selected activity equals updated activity, and once again we'll say as activity. So with this in place, we could go back to our activity form now, and what we'll do is inside our render props for our form, we've already got the is submitting. So what we can do is change our loading indicator to is submitting, so that we still see the loading flag. And this should be good. We should be down to 0 errors now after that refactoring. And what we should also find, if we just refresh the page, is that for any activities that we're hosting, so let's pick on this first one, click on View, click on Manage, and update the activity, we should still see the loading flag. We should get taken to our activity, and everything looks good. And if we go back to our activities and we create an activity, and let's say test create with attendee, and say test and give it a category and pick a date, let's say 12th of Jan, 2 p.m. and we say test and test for the location details, we should be able to click submit. We'll get taken to our new activity. We've got Bob as the host already listed there. And if we go back to our activities, we should see that in the list, and we can see test create with attendee hosted by Bob, along with the additional information there as well. Excellent. What we'll take a look at next is how we can cancel activities.